Welcome to this explainer. Grab your notebooks because today we're building a highly structured, chronological roadmap of modern British history. We're diving straight into the hardcore facts, the specific stats, places, and vital events you need to know about the evolution of British race relations and immigration law over the last century. Let's get right into it.
Here is our revision agenda for today. First, the 1905 Aliens Act. Second, 1948, focusing on the Windrush and nationality. Third, the 1965 Race Relations Act. Fourth, the 1993 Stephen Lawrence case. And finally, we'll pull it all together and review a century of change. Definitely lock these four critical dates into your memory: 1905, 1948, 1965, and 1993. Together, they represent a massive 100-year shift in Britain. We're talking about a journey that starts with strict border restriction and ends with deep societal introspection.
Section 1. The 1905 Aliens Act, where it all begins with immigration restriction.
So let's set the scene. Between 1870 and 1914, roughly 120,000 to 150,000 Jewish migrants from Eastern Europe settled in Britain. These were people fleeing absolute poverty and violent, systemic anti-Jewish attacks, known as pogroms, over in the Russian Empire. When they arrived, they mainly clustered in very specific urban areas: the East End of London, Manchester, Leeds, and Liverpool. Now, this very specific influx of people really generated a wave of rising public concern, and that concern directly led to a brand new piece of legislation.
The resulting 1905 Act introduced a pretty striking phrase into British law: undesirable immigrants. This legislation didn't just toss that word around. It actually created new immigration boards and gave officers the explicit legal power to stop anyone slapped with that label from even landing. So, who exactly were they targeting? Well, it included people deemed too poor to support themselves, those who were mentally ill, criminals, or anyone they basically thought was likely to become dependent on public funds.
The macro-social shift here is just staggering, and it's totally crucial for your notes. Before this act, Britain really prided itself as a country of relative asylum, with open entry. This changed everything. Now, even though the actual wording of the law didn't single out Jews specifically, the whole thing was heavily shaped by hostility toward Jewish immigration. In practice, the British state had just established the power to label certain migrants as a social or economic problem before they even stepped off the boat.
Moving on to Section 2, 1948, Windrush and nationality. Let's see how the post-war landscape flipped the script. Fast forward to the 21st of June 1948. Exactly 1,027 passengers arrived at Tilbury Docks in Essex aboard the HMT Empire Windrush, stepping off the very next day. Over 800 of these passengers listed their last country of residence as somewhere in the Caribbean, places like Jamaica, Trinidad, St. Lucia, Grenada, and Barbados. Now, why were they coming? Well, Britain was facing massive post-war labor shortages. These migrants, and it's important to remember that some had literally just served Britain during the Second World War, were arriving to help rebuild the nation. They were stepping into crucial jobs in the NHS, London transport, and manufacturing.
This exact era brought a really vital legal status into play, CUKC, which stands for Citizen of the United Kingdom and Colonies. Now, there's a fascinating historical quirk to note here. The British Nationality Act 1948 received royal assent in July 1948, but it didn't technically become law until January 1949. So the Windrush actually arrived in June 1948, just before the act fully passed. But regardless of the timing, this act formally recognized that people from Britain's colonies and the Commonwealth had a very real legal connection to Britain, and importantly, the absolute right to live and work there.
Zooming out a bit, the legacy of the wider Windrush generation, which covers those arriving between 1948 and 1973, really has two sides to it. On one hand, it absolutely highlights Britain's heavy dependence on migrant labor just to keep the country running, but on the other hand, it totally exposed the severe reality of discrimination. These new arrivals faced incredibly blatant racism in their daily lives. We're talking in housing, employment, education, and policing. Which brings us to Section 3, 1965, the Race Relations Act. Time for some anti-discrimination laws. Britain's very first major anti-discrimination law was, honestly, defined just as much by what it completely missed as by what it actually covered. While it made discrimination unlawful in places of public resort, think hotels, pubs, restaurants, theaters, and public transport, and it successfully set up the Race Relations Board, it left out massive chunks of everyday life. It completely missed the two areas where discrimination was arguably the most devastating for people: employment and housing.
And because housing wasn't covered, phrases like no blacks, no dogs, no Irish remained a perfectly legal, absolute reality on rental signs all over the country. Imagine that. Black and Asian migrants were having their entire lives severely restricted by prejudice that was still perfectly sanctioned in the housing and job markets. This massive, gaping hole in the law proves exactly why, later, much stronger legislation, like the Race Relations Acts of 1968 and 1976, were just so desperately needed.
So, practically speaking, the 1965 Act was super cautious. It was limited and it was incomplete. But symbolically, it was monumental. For the very first time, Parliament officially accepted that racism wasn't just some private individual flaw. They recognized it as a major public problem that actually required the force of law to fix. It was a vital, even if flawed, first step for British democracy.
Let's step into the modern era with Section 4, 1993, the Stephen Lawrence case, and a true national reckoning.
On the 22nd of April 1993, an 18-year-old black British student named Stephen Lawrence was murdered in a completely unprovoked, horrific racist attack. He was just waiting for a bus with his friend Dwayne Brooks on Wellhall Road in Eltham, southeast London. The initial investigation by the Metropolitan Police was, to put it bluntly, a massive failure. It was heavily marred by how they treated the family, the witnesses, and the evidence, and it resulted in 0 initial convictions. But Stephen's parents, Doreen and Neville Lawrence, refused to give up. They launched a relentless, decades-long campaign for justice. And incredibly, nearly 19 years later in 2012, 2 men, Gary Dobson and David Norris, were finally convicted of his murder.
Initially, the authorities and much of society viewed this crime simply as a horrific act of individual racist behavior. But the family's relentless campaigning led to the 1999 Macpherson Report, spearheaded by Sir William Macpherson, which laid out 70 distinct recommendations. This report shifted the entire national conversation. It essentially proved that the problem wasn't just isolated individuals acting out on the street. The core issue was racism deeply embedded in the systems, procedures, and institutions of the state itself.
And that realization brought a truly crucial term to the forefront: institutional racism. Definitely highlight this definition in your notes. The Stephen Lawrence case forced Britain to confront a very harsh reality. It showed everyone that passing laws for legal equality back in the 1960s and 70s did not magically prevent profound, systemic injustices from occurring inside the justice system and the police force in the 1990s.
Finally, Section 5, a century of change. Let's review the whole timeline. Pulling all of these revision notes together over a 100-year evolution, we see a massive, definitive shift. We started Step 1 in 1905, totally focused on active border restriction and keeping people out. Then, by Step 2 in 1948, severe post-war labor needs introduced Commonwealth citizenship and large-scale Caribbean migration. At Step 3 in 1965, the ugly domestic reality of discrimination forces the government to finally start creating anti-discrimination laws. And finally, by Step 4 in 1993, society is pushed into a full national reckoning, forced to look inward at the racism embedded deep inside its own protective institutions.
As you review all these milestones, it really leaves us with one incredibly vital question to ponder. Does legal equality automatically mean justice in practice? We've seen the rulebooks change over an entire century, but as that journey from 1965 to 1993 shows us, rewriting the law is literally just the first step. How do historical laws actually translate into everyday real-world fairness? Something to think about for your exams. Thanks for tuning into this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.